This is where we are.
And so this is our, I guess, third podcast for student development theory. And today we're talking about, or just doing the introduction to multiple modes of multiple identities. And for class, the students read the Burgess and Huftelin article about social identity-based difference, and then understanding the meaning that students make when they begin to understand identities. So my first question for today's podcast would just be, what are some key points or some key highlights from the article that you would suggest that they're aware of?
Well, these key points happen on a couple of different levels. So if you are all doc students, which any number of you are going to be someday, I'd say that one of the things to take away from this article is the structure, because they do a nice job with the lit review, which has a lot of utility. They do a nice job with describing their methodology. So it's just a nicely structured article that helps you understand what a relatively complex research study looks like. That's one thing to take away. We spend so much time with these theories and these models, and we don't always stop to pause and say, how did we get to this? How do we know this? How did we arrive at this place? Well, this article does a really great job of talking about that. It also does a nice job of highlighting not all the participants, but three that really have something meaningful to say. So you get a clear understanding of what this through line is from what were the different things we asked of these participants? What were the data points? So how did we get data from these participants? And then how do we use that? How do we better understand this topic? And how do we get to these findings? So it's a really good article in terms of the content, but it's also a really good article when you think about what the structure is. So they give you what the findings are. They tell you what these themes are that they come away from under doing all this data analysis across these different data points. So we've got heightening awareness, we've got challenges and benefits. There was another one in here. Anyway,
Recursivity, I think is what they
recursivity.
called it.
Yes,
Yeah.
recursivity. So recursivity, that's a great one, because that's what we tell you to do all the time. We
Mhm.
want you to think about things. We want you to reflect. And that's really what they're talking about as these participants are moving back and forth and in and out of different ways of understanding, is they're really reflecting on things. It also talks about environmental influences, which is another
Mhm.
reason I like this. It really brings together identity development, but it looks at what the impact of identity development, or what the impact of environments are on identity development. And they talk about nested environments within and outside the university, which is something we have to think about with our students. I mean, can you think about who this is reflective of? Who have we studied this semester that you might use to make meaning around this? Oh, let me pause. Let me think. Bronfenbrenner, maybe?
Mhm.
So Bronfenbrenner is another way to understand some of these findings. But, those are some of the things I would take away, I think. And it's got a nice implication for research and practice. And for our purposes, we spend more time paying attention to the implications for practice. But those are some of the main things that people should be looking at with this.
And I know this is not necessarily part of the article, but it's more of a reflection on this program. I know in my master's program, we did not spend a lot of time talking about the influence of environments on college student identity development. We touched on it a little bit, but I didn't really think about it. And I mean, obviously it's important. We never talked about it in my master's program. So I think that's a benefit of this program too, where we really understand the impact of environments and bringing that into our work in the future.
I think that's a
Um,
good point. And I've mentioned this before, that a lot of that person environment interaction material has it's not, I don't want to say it's fallen out of favor, but people don't use it that much, and there's reasons for
Mhm.
that. But God bless Chris Wren for bringing back Bronfenbrenner, because I think Bronfenbrenner helps us understand a lot of this more fully.
Mhm.
I may have said this before, but we used to have a whole course of the master's program, just environments. And probably 7 or 8 years ago, we merged student development theory and environments into student development theory 1 and 2, because the student development theory literature just kind of exploded. And that's why
Mhm.
environments is just part of this class. But I'm glad you said that, because I feel very strongly about this being important, that you can't understand this material, and you can't understand development if you don't understand the context of it. It's too amorphous. It's just kind of floating out there. It has to be grounded in context.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I think that that's one of the disconnects maybe between what students learn in student development theory classes and then when they try to implement in their environment in work, and they potentially don't see student development theory in their work anymore when they get to full time, but it might be because they're not looking at it through the context of their environment.
That's an incredibly good point.
And
That, and oftentimes they're working with practitioners who don't have a real fondness for student development theory, or don't think it's worthwhile, and so they don't pay any attention to it, and students don't get supported in using it.
mhm.
And it's
Yeah.
hard to
So
be an entry level person being the one pushing that agenda. That's not easy. It's not fair. It's not, I mean, it's your job to do it, but it's
mhm.
not your job to educate everybody else in it. And I hear that
No.
so often from alums after they've been in their first jobs.
Yeah, so I think this is a really good segue into our my next question would be, so we've read this article, we're starting beginning to talk about multiple identities and reflecting on identities. So how would you say that students could bring the information from this article into their practice?
I think the best thing they can do is they can sit down and they can look at the implications for practice section, which is on page 16. If you've downloaded it, it's on page 39, starts on page 392 if you're looking at the PDF. And it gives you this list of things, and it talks about: consider the contextual implications of identity, examine structures that create boundaries rather than focusing on individual differences as real. So what this article is telling us to do is to understand the multiplicity of identities people hold. And they've done such a great job with these three participants that they highlight, talking about what their multiple identities are, how they show up, what the implications for their lives are. And so that's one thing about student development theory. And students in the past would get so frustrated and they'd say, isn't there a theory that talks about the whole student? Well, we do a good job with identity development, and we'll talk about this as we're going forward, of we pull it apart. I mean, it's like you have this identity, you have this identity, you have this identity. I mean, even look at the way we work with identity-based centers on
Mm,
campuses. If you look on this campus, we have multicultural student MSP, multicultural
yeah.
services and programs. Okay, so what does multicultural mean? I mean, who knows what that means? What it is in practice is that's where the Black students go. They
Yeah.
go to MSP. Some Latinx students go there. But
Mhm.
beyond that, I'm not sure who else goes there. I know those two groups of students go there.
The
And I think
LGBT
that
resource centers in that building
the
along with
LGBT
international
Resource
students. Yep.
Center. Um, I don't know where other groups of students go, and that's my fault for not being as up to speed on it. But I think we have to be aware of many, many, many identities that may not get reflected in those identity-based centers. Um, and we experience them differently. I
Mhm.
mean, we experience the combination of our identities differently. And so I think that's one of the things that this is pointing out, is that you can't just look at one dimension of someone's identity, and you can't take them out of context.
Yeah, and I think Something this article talked about was the students navigating their biracial identity.
Yes.
And how do you, I guess the question is for students or in general, how do you navigate your, multiple identities when maybe a resource center or a space is only open for one of those identities and you hold multiple, like it's just a dualistic or multiplistic realities, right? So I think
Yes.
that Aiden and I forget the other student who was Navajo's name, but they had a hard time navigating their biracial identity in different contexts throughout. So the other thing I think was funny was when you mentioned that students asked, is there one student development theory? It's the same question I have in my textbook from 2013.
Right.
Yes, the exact same question I wrote after Chickering was like, is there just one that
Is there
does
one
like,
big one that covers
yeah,
everything? So we just really can focus on exactly who everybody is in all their identities? No,
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 mm-mm,
there is
no.
not. But we need to be better at looking at multiple identities. And like this study does, looking at multiple identities in context.
Yeah. So I think um, we've talked a lot about students and there are students of multiple identities. But my question would be, how do our multiple identities play into the work that we do as student affairs practitioners? So like how do, like, I guess our master students or how do our identities in general play into this?
Well, the first thing they do is we have to acknowledge that, yes, they do play into it. And
Hmm.
we have to examine and interrogate, tease out. But we have to figure out what our multiple identities are and what do they mean. You and I need to identify and push on our whiteness. And what does that
Hmm.
mean? Um, I need to push on being, upper middle class. See, it's so hard for me to even say that because I grew up working class. So it's really
Yeah.
hard for me to acknowledge that I'm upper middle class now. Um, I need to examine that. I need to examine what it means to be somebody who's really well educated. And my other identities, my identity as a Christian, my identity as a cis woman, my identity as somebody who's straight, all of those different pieces, we need to examine those and think about how they show up, because you can't just show up in your good personhood. You
Hmm.
can't show up in your I am an SA pro hood. You have to really, really interrogate those identities, and not only what they mean, but what they show up as and how they
Hmm.
show up and how that gets played out in different contexts. So the first thing we have to do before we can work with students and their multiple identities is we have to figure out our own multiple identities.